Europe would not be able to defend itself against Putin without Ukraine. Those were the surprising comments made by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy during an interview with the Polish media outlet Onet this month. This isn't Zelenskyy claiming that Europe is a weak partner. Instead, he points to a combination of the rest of Europe having lived in peace for so long and the unbridled brutality that Putin has shown in his special military operation to make a clear point. Europe isn't ready for the fight. At least it's not ready if it doesn't work alongside Ukraine, that has spent almost 3 years bravely defending against Russia and chipping away at one of the world's strongest military powers. These are bold comments from Ukraine's president, and they lead us to some questions. Is Zelenskyy right? Would the rest of Europe crumble under the might of Putin's invading forces, or is the continent capable of standing up against a rampaging leader who's shown he's as willing to kill his own people as he is his enemy just to achieve his objectives? Before we begin our search for an answer, let's dig into what Zelenskyy actually said. On January 15, 2025, Pravda reported on the comments Ukraine's president made to Polish media. Zelenskyy had been quizzed on the possibility of the Ukraine war ending with Donald Trump ascending to the office of US president. His response showcases who he believes to be the bigger threat to Putin and his ambitions. "I'm sure that Russia fears the United States, fears China, and fears a united Europe," he told the Polish media outlet. "Without the Ukrainian army, Europe cannot cope with the Russian army because the Russian army is bigger. Russia has more weapons, more people, and is more brutal than Europeans," he added. In other words, Russia is scared of the US, but Putin thinks he can defeat Europe. Zelenskyy doesn't mean this as a criticism of Europe as a continent. Rather, he's highlighting the fact that most of Europe hasn't been involved in a war on the scale of the one Putin wages against Ukraine for decades. Most Europeans live in a democracy, says Ukraine's president, and they don't know what war is. Zelenskyy has a point. Most of the few European nations that have been involved in wars over the last few decades haven't been forced to fight on their own soil. For example, the UK was involved in both the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns that began in the wake of September 11, 2001, but in neither case was Britain itself ever invaded or under any sort of direct threat from those opposing countries. War with Russia would be different. It would see Putin's forces attempting to march through Europe, backed by thousands of tanks, constant missile and drone strikes, and the ever-looming threat of nuclear weapons. Europe, Zelenskyy argues, is nowhere near ready for that kind of war. And worst of all, according to Ukraine's president, Putin understands that fact. Putin knows this and talks about it in his entourage. Therefore, he will quickly move on if Ukraine does not defend itself. That's a fact, Zelenskyy concludes. He delivers a chilling message here. Ukraine was first, the rest of Europe is next if Ukraine crumbles. On the one hand, we can view these comments as an attempt by Zelenskyy to wring even more support from his European compatriots. He alludes to that himself, repeatedly referring to Ukraine in terms of it being the best defense Europe has against Putin's invading forces. Politico adds to the comments shared by Pravda, noting that Ukraine's president also said, "This one statement, referring to Europe not being ready, contains the answer to all questions. If you know for sure that the Russians will go further, why not strengthen Ukraine as much as possible? Increase production at home for your armed forces." In other words, Europe needs to build more weapons to send to Ukraine so it can fend off Putin's forces. But on the other hand, it's possible that Zelenskyy is trying to deliver a warning to a continent that has for too long allowed Putin's tyrannical reign in Russia to continue. Over 2 decades of underestimating Putin's capability for brutality and imperialism has led to Europe going soft. Many in Europe have lived so comfortably for so long that they have no comprehension of the sort of fighting that is currently going on in Ukraine. Zelenskyy is probably right about that. But is he right about Europe not being able to defend itself if Ukraine falls and Putin sets his sights on the rest of the continent? There are cases both for and against Zelensky's argument. The immediate case against it is that NATO exists. Right now, the majority of major European countries are members of that collective defense organization, which means they not only benefit from working together to defend against Russia, but also have the United States looking over their shoulders. If there's one country that can claim to be stronger than Russia, at least on the equipment quantity and quality fronts, it's the US. Should Putin invade any NATO member nation, including the likes of France, Germany, Poland, the UK, and many more, Article 5 of NATO's charter would trigger, bringing the United States into the fight. That alone would be reason enough for Putin to avoid war with the rest of Europe, were it not for one problem. America's status within NATO is on shaky ground. New US President Donald Trump made several comments about pulling America out of NATO during his first stint as president. His contention at the time was that most of Europe wasn't paying its way on the defense front, something that Zelenskyy alludes to when discussing Europe's lack of preparation, and was instead relying on the US as a defense partner. That possibility of a US-NATO split still exists. In February 2024, Trump's former national security advisor John Bolton claimed that Trump told him the US will be out of NATO if he managed to secure a second presidential term. NATO would be in real jeopardy. I think we would try to get out, Bolton told CNN at the time. The US pulling out of NATO wouldn't be as simple as Trump signing an executive order and being done with it all. The 2020 National Defense Authorization Act spells that out, with Section 1250A of the Act saying that no US president can withdraw America from NATO unless at least 2/3 of the Senate concur with the president's decision, or an act of Congress carries that decision through. In other words, there would be voting and potential legal battles if Trump tries to pull the US out of NATO. But what if he managed it? Where would that leave Europe in its potential fight against Russia? On the numbers front, it seems that Europe stacks up fairly well against Putin's invading forces, giving some hope that it will be able to defend itself without the US if Ukraine fell. That's according to the UK Defense Journal, which posed the question of how NATO would fare against Russia in a world where the United States was no longer a member. It argues that Europe's NATO members, bearing in mind that there are other European countries that aren't members, combine to create a military that's vastly superior to Russia's. The immediate manpower numbers seem to play out in Europe's favor. The journal claims that European NATO has 1.5 million active service members. That's just under 200,000 more than Russia, according to national military power aggregator Global Firepower. However, Russia also has 250,000 paramilitary forces, for which the UK Defense Journal doesn't account. It also has around 2 million reserve personnel that Putin would be almost guaranteed to call upon if Russia went to war with the rest of Europe. That's not to say that Europe brings no paramilitary or reserve forces to the table. Several European countries, including Greece, Cyprus, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, and the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, have compulsory military service. That creates a fairly substantial supply of trained reserves that Europe can call upon, along with the reserves held by countries that don't have any form of conscription. The UK, for instance, has 32,000 potential soldiers in reserve and 140,000 active forces. Other heavy hitters such as France have smaller stocks of reserves at 26,000 people, but in France's case, paramilitary forces of around 150,000 make up for that national shortfall. Then there are countries like Poland, which not only bring massive reserves to the table, 350,000 reserves versus around 202,000 active military personnel, but also paramilitary forces numbering about 50,000. Why does any of this matter? Putin's approach to the Ukraine war has seen him try to grind out a win based on Russia's manpower advantage over Ukraine. In many places, he uses human wave attacks to batter Ukraine's defenses, forcing his opponent to expend valuable ammunition to take out these waves until their stocks are depleted and Russia can finally overwhelm them. This has been such a successful tactic for Putin, albeit one that results in slow gains, because Russia has a vast manpower advantage over Ukraine. He wouldn't have that advantage over all of Europe. So trying to follow the same tactics in a continent-wide war would quickly see Russia realize that it can't compete on the manpower front. At least that's the UK Defense Journal's argument. It also contends that collective Europe has a much better military than the one Ukraine had when Putin began his special military operation. Of course, Ukraine's military has been bolstered enormously since, with the aid of its Western partners. But the journal's point here is that this strength manifests not just in manpower, but equipment. For instance, Russia had around 13,000 tanks and 1,000 fighter jets before the war. It's lost thousands of the former, around 10,000 tanks destroyed, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. And it's shown itself incapable of establishing aerial dominance with the latter. Furthermore, Russia is now massively relying on its Soviet-era stockpiles to batter Ukraine. The country's brave defense has forced Putin to burn through these stockpiles, limiting Russia's past equipment advantage further and potentially placing Europe in a position where it's bringing better weapons to the fight. Even without Ukraine, that equipment advantage could stack up. Europe collectively has thousands of modern battle tanks of its own, as well as access to more advanced fighter jets like the Eurofighter Typhoon and the Saab Gripen. Even without direct US involvement through NATO, many European nations have also purchased American-made weapons. Britain has a stock of Tomahawk cruise missiles. Several European nations have America's advanced F-35 fighter jets, and you have to imagine that the US would be willing to sell more of these weapons to European countries if war with Russia erupted, even if America itself didn't directly support Europe in the fight. So the numbers game suggests that Europe will be able to match or even exceed Russia in most departments. That creates a pretty strong argument for a European victory in any war that broke out with Russia on the continent. But if that's the case, why is Zelenskyy so adamant that Europe would have no chance against Russia if Ukraine wasn't around to fight? Much of the answer comes down to what Ukraine has experienced in its fight with Putin. Take the manpower issue. Yes, Europe has an overall advantage over Russia in terms of the sheer number of troops it can field, but Putin isn't only fielding Russian soldiers. He's paying contracted mercenaries to fight in his military too, and as of late 2024, North Korean soldiers have entered the fighting in the war on Russia's behalf. That's the result of a cooperative defense pact Russia signed with North Korea in the summer of 2024, and it's already seen around 12,000 North Korean soldiers arrive in Russia to take part in Putin's Kursk counteroffensive. More may be coming, especially as there's now talk of North Korea starting a rotational system whereby it withdraws the troops that it has in Russia to replace them with fresh soldiers every couple of months. Why does that matter if Europe goes to war with Russia? Russia isn't alone either. North Korea is far from the military superpower it would like the world to believe it is. Its equipment is ramshackle and old, and its soldiers aren't trained to anywhere near the standard of a modern Western soldier. But what the country's military has in abundance is people, a staggering 1.32 million in its active military, along with 560,000 reserves and 100,000 paramilitary forces. Putin wouldn't need these soldiers arriving from North Korea to be competent in a fight against Europe. He would use them as cannon fodder, feeding North Korean President Kim Jong-un cash and military secrets to keep him sending more, to wear down Europe's collective defenses. The continent's manpower advantage disappears, and it's forced into fighting the same brutal war that Ukraine has faced for the last 3 years. That brings us to the second reason why Zelenskyy believes Europe couldn't defeat Russia without Ukraine: Putin's wanton brutality. We see that brutality when it comes to the sheer scale of the war crimes Russia's forces have committed against Ukraine. Attacks against civilians in Ukrainian cities are common, with the week beginning January 13th seeing Putin launch 550 drones, 60 missiles, and 660 glide bombs, predominantly at Ukraine's energy infrastructure and population centers. That's just 1 week's worth of attacks, and right from the beginning of this special military operation, Putin was giving the okay for his troops to commit war crimes. Unlawful violence, looting, and threats against civilians were common in Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine during the first 2 weeks of the invasion. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine concluded that Russia has committed numerous war crimes, including the use of illegal explosives, executions, torture, and indiscriminate attacks, all against civilians. Russia has done all of this despite being party to the Geneva Convention, which outright bans many of the tactics Putin has used to attack Ukraine. It's very likely that Russia's leader would approve the same types of war crimes in other European nations he invades, which raises an interesting question: would those European nations respond in kind? Most are also parties to the Geneva Convention and would likely attempt to fight a war with Russia bound by the rules outlined in those conventions. Russia clearly hasn't and won't in its fight against Europe. That could give Putin's forces an edge as Europe attempts to adapt, especially if Putin is able to invade territory and bring his missiles, drones, and bombs within range of major European cities. Would the rest of Europe stoop to Russia's level by committing war crimes of its own? Even if it got to that point, the sheer scale of the brutality Putin displays could be enough to catch many of his European adversaries off guard, at least during the early stages of the fighting. Just as Zelenskyy implied when he said that Europe hasn't seen a war like the one his country is fighting against Russia. Add to this Putin's barbaric tactics, such as the human waves we mentioned earlier, and the sheer shock of the nature of a war with Russia could be enough to cause serious problems for the rest of Europe, if not for Ukraine absorbing the brunt of Putin's attacks. Russia is willing to break the rules of warfare constantly. How many of the European countries against which he'd fight would be willing to do the same? Next up, weapons production. Zelenskyy also touched on that issue, claiming that Europe should ramp up production to support Ukraine. The implication is that not only is Europe not producing enough weapons for what Zelenskyy sees as the Ukrainian front line of a war that could engulf Europe, but the continent is collectively not producing enough to defend itself. And he might be right. In its report on Zelenskyy's comments, UNN noted that less than 30% of the weapons Ukraine is using against Russia come from Europe. The bulk, 40%, come from the United States, which may not be a factor if Trump pulls the country out of NATO. The rest are domestically produced in Ukraine. That alone is a sign that Europe's weapons production may not be where it needs to be to sustain a war against Russia. Yes, Europe has the better weapons right now, buoyed by Ukraine having destroyed so much of Russia's war machine. But no European country outside of Ukraine is actively producing enough weapons to continue the sort of sustained attritional war Putin would be likely to wage. Zelenskyy isn't the only one who thinks so. In April 2024, director of the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative at the Atlantic Council, Andrew A. Mishta, wrote in Politico that Europe has been slow to increase its weapons and munitions production. That affects Ukraine directly. Europe isn't providing the level of support Kyiv needs, argues Mishta. But it also means Europe will be in trouble in the event of a Russian victory. Procrastination and indecisive action reign in Europe, according to Mishta, which has led to delays in support and a general attitude within Europe outside of Ukraine that not a lot has changed. In other words, most European countries have grown complacent. The entire continent, barring a few former Soviet states such as the Baltic trio of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania that believe they'll be next if Putin wins in Ukraine, seem to be underestimating the true threat that Russia poses. Putin himself seems to think so. Speaking in June 2024, Russia's leader noted that Europe does not have a developed early warning system for the nuclear warheads Russia could bring to a conflict. In this sense, they are more or less defenseless, claimed Putin. Whether that's typical Russian rhetoric or not, it shows that Putin is confident he could force most of Europe to submit to his whims. And even if we take nuclear weapons out of the equation, Russia is outpacing Europe in terms of weapons production. In December 2024, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute revealed that the revenues of Russia's leading defense contractors are higher than their contemporaries in both the US and Europe. Even accounting for corruption in Russia, that simple fact means that Russia is spending far more on building weapons than Europe. Collectively, Russia's defense firms saw their revenues grow by 40% in 2024, with Europe's manufacturers recording just a 0.2% increase in the same timeframe. Of course, Russia is spending more because it's actively at war with Ukraine. But Zelensky's point still stands. Europe's defense industry seems to be stagnant at a time when he believes the continent should be preparing more than ever to fight Putin. That brings us to the final reason Europe isn't ready for war with Russia. It's already at war with Putin. It just doesn't know it yet. No, Putin isn't sending tanks rolling into the rest of Europe, and he's not launching drones and missiles yet. But he is waging a hybrid war that's wreaking havoc on European infrastructure and influencing political discourse in Russia's favor. There are plenty of examples. The incendiary bomb that exploded on a grounded and thankfully delayed plane at Leipzig airport in 2024 is believed to have been planted there by Russian agents who may be conducting trials for similar attacks in the future. Russia is using the entire toolbox, from influencing political discussions to cyber attacks on critical infrastructure to sabotage on a significant scale against European nations, according to former president of Germany's Federal Domestic Intelligence Agency, Thomas Haldenwang. In November 2024, a pair of undersea telecommunications cables in the Baltic Sea were cut, likely due to Russian actions. December 26th of the same year saw Finnish authorities detain a Russian oil tanker named Eagle S on suspicion of damaging 4 more Baltic Sea telecommunications cables, along with a major power cable. According to Leiden University, Russia conducted 44 hybrid warfare activities that we know of across Europe compared to just 13 the year before. It also influenced at least 56 acts of vandalism, sabotage, and operations inciting targeted violence across Europe since the beginning of Putin's special military operation. There's a mindset issue at play here, and Zelenskyy knows it. He sees that Putin is already at war with Europe, at least in his own mind, and that Russia's leader has given himself a head start with these hybrid operations. Combine what Ukraine's president believes is Russia's coming brutality if Ukraine falls, and perhaps Europe isn't as ready for a fight with Russia as it would like to believe. But what do you think? Is Putin preparing to unleash a full-scale war throughout Europe if he manages to defeat Ukraine? And if that war happens, will Europe be able to defend itself without Ukraine and ultimately overcome Putin's aggression? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Europe can't allow Russia to win, or click this other video instead.